My mother found a dead man down by Antelope Creek the autumn I turned 8, and he was the best thing that ever happened to us. I know how that sounds. I've had 60 years to say it gentler and never found a way that's truer. He wasn't dead, of course, though the doctor at Marrow would later say there was no earthly reason he shouldn't have been, with a furrow plowed across the side of his skull where a bullet had skipped off the bone. But he was as close to it as a living man gets. I was the one who found him first, and I have never in my life run so hard as I ran back up that bank, hollering for my mother, my boots full of creek water and my heart trying to climb out my throat. It was me that brought her down there. So whatever good came after, I take a little credit for it, the way a boy takes credit for the sunrise because he was awake to see it. We were poor that fall in a way I didn't have the sense to be scared of. My father had been 3 years in the ground by then, a green horse, a bad fence, a fall that broke something in him that no doctor could see and no praying could fix. He'd lingered a winter and then he'd gone, and he'd left my mother 160 acres of hard ground along the creek, a barn that leaned, a string of half-broke horses he'd never finished gentling, and a note at the cedar bench bank that came due a little more every season than the place could pay. My mother's name was Cora Hale. She was not yet 30 that autumn, though grief and work had put a stillness in her face that made strangers think her older. She wore my father's coat in the cold because it was warmer than her own and because, I think, it still smelled faintly of him. She rose before light and she worked past dark, and she did the labor of 2 men and a hired hand all by herself, and she never once let me see her cry, though I heard her sometimes through the wall, low and brief, the way you'd let a kettle hiss off the worst of its steam before it could whistle and wake somebody. The town did not help us. I want to be fair, a town is just people, and people are mostly busy with their own troubles, and a few of them were kind. The widow Aldous sent eggs. Old Berto at the livery would shoe our horses and forget to write down what we owed. But mostly the town looked at a young widow trying to hold a man's place together and decided, the way towns will, that the situation was unnatural and would resolve itself soon, and the only question was who'd end up with the land. Garrick Voss thought it ought to be him. Voss had the spread north of us, good grass and a poor creek, and our creek was the best water in that whole stretch of the Coldwater bottoms. He came around twice that fall in his town coat, smiling, to remind my mother how hard a woman's lot was and how reasonable his offer remained. The second time he brought the banker, a soft man named Prout, and the 2 of them stood in our yard and talked to my mother about her note as though they were doing her a kindness by mentioning it. "Come spring you'll see it my way, Cora," Voss said, and he said her given name like he had some right to it. "No shame in it, a woman alone." "I'm not alone," my mother said. "I've got my boy." Voss looked at me. I was 8 and skinny and barefoot, and I was holding a hen against my chest because I'd been told to put it up and hadn't gotten to it. He smiled at me the way a man smiles at a fence post. "Sure," he said, "sure you do." When they rode off, my mother stood a long while looking at the dust they left, and then she went and split wood until full dark, more wood than we could burn in a month, and I knew not to say anything to her until the sound of the axe stopped. That was October. The creek was low and clear and cold, running over its stones with that small, endless conversation a creek keeps up with itself. I'd been sent down to mend a place in the fence where a heifer kept getting out, and I'd taken my time about it the way boys do, poking at the water with a stick, hunting for the gray crawdads that backed into the dark under the rocks. That's how I came on him. I thought at first he was a heap of someone's cast-off clothes washed down in the last rain. Then I saw the hand. It was a man's hand, half in the water, the fingers curled loose, and there was blood gone brown all down the side of his head and into the gravel, and he was so still that I knew, the way you know a struck bird from a sleeping one, that something terrible had happened to him. I stood there with my stick, and then his chest moved, just barely, just a little rise like the last of the air leaving a thing, but it moved. I dropped the stick and I ran. My mother did not waste a breath asking me was I sure or had I imagined it. She took one look at my face and she was already moving, pulling the wagon out, throwing in a blanket and the jug and the lantern though it was day. And we went down to the creek with her standing up driving the team hard over the rough ground. And I held on and watched her face. And her face had something in it I hadn't seen since before my father died. She had a thing to do. That was all. She had found in the middle of her own drowning, somebody drowning worse, and it steadied her like ballast. We got him into the wagon between us, and he was heavy as a fallen tree and just as unhelpful, and my mother kept saying low, "Easy, easy now," to him though he couldn't hear her, the way you'd gentle a horse. His face under the blood was younger than I'd expected and harder than a young face ought to be, with a few days' beard and a white seam of an old scar through one eyebrow. His clothes were good once and ruined now. He had no hat, no gun, no horse, no boots, even somebody had taken his boots. His feet were cut to ribbons. He'd walked or crawled a long way to that creek before he gave out. Somebody did this to him, my mother said. She wasn't talking to me. She was looking at the part in his hair where the bullet had gone. Somebody shot this man and left him. "Is he gonna die?" I asked. She tucked the blanket close around him. "Not today," she said, "if I have anything to say about it." We got him up to the house and into my dead father's bed, which my mother had not slept in since the funeral. She cut his ruined shirt off him, and there were marks on him that told a story I was too young to read. An old bullet scar low on one side, a knife's white memory across the ribs, the kind of writing a hard life leaves on a body. She washed the wound on his head with creek water boiled and cooled, and she packed it and bound it, and she did it all with a steadiness that I leaned against like a wall. Then she sat by him. She sat by him that whole first night, and the next, spooning water and a little broth between his cracked lips whenever he'd swallow. And on the third day she sent me on the mule to fetch the doctor from Marrow, 12 miles. And I rode it in something under 2 hours and near foundered the mule, and she never scolded me for it. The doctor's name was Pyle. He looked at the wound and he looked at the man a long time and he said what I told you, that there was no reason on God's earth this fellow ought to be breathing. "A half-inch the other way," he said, "and you'd have buried him by the creek where you found him." He cleaned it better than my mother had been able to, and he left her powders, and he stood in our doorway pulling on his gloves. "You know who he is?" he asked. "No," my mother said. "You know what he is?" Pyle nodded back at the bed at the scars he'd seen. "A man comes by marks like that honest sometimes. Mostly he don't. You take care, Cora. A man that somebody went to the trouble of shooting in the head, somebody might come to finish the job, and not care over much who's standing near him when they do." My mother saw him to his horse. I heard her at the door, quiet. "He's in my house, doctor. I'm not going to put a hurt man back out in the cold to die so I can sleep easier. That's not a thing I know how to do." Pyle looked at her and something in his face gave way to something kinder. "No," he said, "I don't expect it is." And he rode off toward Marrow, and we were alone again with the stranger, and that night, for the first time, he opened his eyes. I was the one awake. My mother had finally let herself doze in the chair, and I'd crept in to look at him the way you'd creep up to look at a wild thing you'd caught, half hopping and half scared it would look back. And it did. His eyes came open all at once, gray and clear and terribly empty, and they found me, and I about jumped out of my skin. "Ma," I said not loud, "Ma." She was up and beside him instantly. The man's eyes moved to her and stayed. His mouth worked. When his voice came, it was a ruin, dry as a dropped husk. "Where he got out?" "You're safe," my mother said. "You're in my house. My boy found you down at the creek. You were hurt bad. You've been 3 days sleeping." He took this in. I watched him take it in, and I watched something behind his eyes go searching, and I watched it come back empty-handed, and I saw the first true fear cross his face. Not the fear of a man who's been hurt, but the fear of a man who's reached for himself in the dark and found nobody there. "Who?" he said. He swallowed. He tried again. "Who am I?" My mother went very still. You don't know. His hand came up, shaking, and touched the bandage on his head and stopped. His eyes were wet. He was a hard-made man with a killer's scars on him, and he lay in my dead father's bed and looked at the ceiling and could not find his own name, and a tear ran down sideways into the pillow. I don't know anything, he whispered. I don't know anything at all. My mother took his hand. She just took it, the way she'd have taken mine, and held it. Then we'll start there, she said. You're a man and you're alive and you're in the Hale place on Antelope Creek and nobody's going to hurt you under my roof. The rest can wait till you're strong. All right. He held on to her hand like it was the only fixed thing in a turning world. All right, he said. And that was how it began. The doctor had warned us and my mother had heard him. She wasn't a fool. She kept my father's old shotgun loaded behind the door now, where before it had hung empty on its pegs, and for those first weeks she watched the road. But the man could tell us nothing because he knew nothing. Not his name, not where he'd come from, not who had shot him or why. The doctor said it happened sometimes with a hurt like his, that the blow could knock a man's whole life clean out of him like water out of a tipped bucket, and sometimes it ran back in over the years, and sometimes it never did. The man would lie there reaching after himself and come up with nothing, just nothing, a gray fog where a life ought to be, and it grieved him worse than the wound. He healed slow and then all at once, the way strong men do. By the second week he could sit up. By the third he could walk to the door and stand holding the frame, looking out at the yard, at the leaning barn and the half-broke horses, with a strange hunger in him. By the fourth he came out into the yard on his own and stood watching me try to throw a loop over a fence post and miss, and miss, and miss. You're dropping your elbow, he said. It was the first thing he'd said that wasn't an answer to a question. I turned around. He came over slow, favoring himself, and he took the rope out of my hands, and his hands knew what to do with it the way my hands knew how to find my own mouth in the dark. He built a loop without thinking about it. He swung it once easy, and dropped it clean over the post 20 feet off, and then he stood there holding the rope and looking at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger. How'd I know that? He said quietly, to himself. How do I know how to do that and not know my own name? I didn't have an answer. I was 8. I said, will you teach me? He looked down at me, and something crossed his face, surprise mostly, that a person would want a thing from him. Then he crouched down to my level, slow, with a hand to his head, and he put the rope back in my hands and he closed his big scarred fingers over mine to show me how to hold it. Keep your elbow up, he said. Let the loop do the work, you don't have to fight it. That was the first lesson. There were 1,000 after, but I remember that one because it was the first time he forgot, for a minute, to be afraid of himself. It was my mother who gave him his name, and she did it like she did everything, plain and without fuss. It was a Sunday. He'd been with us near a month and he was strong enough now to be useful, and he hated, I could tell, lying about being cared for like an invalid. We were at supper, the 3 of us, and he set down his spoon and he said it had been turning in his mind that we couldn't go on calling him Mr. and you there forever, and that a man ought to have a name even if it wasn't his own. And did my mother have any thoughts? My mother considered him over the table. The lamp was between us. I remember the way the light sat on his hard, healing face. My grandfather used to tell a story, she said, about a man who got swallowed up whole by the sea, by the worst thing that could happen to a man, and was given up for dead, and then was spat back out onto dry land alive with a thing left to do. She passed him the bread. Jonah, his name was, the man the deep gave back. The stranger sat with that. Jonah, he said, like he was trying it on. And what's the thing he's got left to do? That, my mother said, is generally the part a man has to figure out for himself. He looked at her a long moment across the lamp. Jonah, he said again, I could carry that, thank you, Mrs. Hale. Cora, she said, if you're going to be working the place, you'd best call me Cora. So he was Jonah after that, the man the creek gave back, and that's the name I'd use for him for the rest of both our lives, and it fit him better than I think his right one ever could have. He worked. Lord, how that man worked. As soon as he could lift a hammer he was at the barn, and inside a month that leaning barn stood square. He had a way with the half-broke horses my father had left that I'd never seen. He didn't fight them and he didn't sweet-talk them. He just got in close and quiet and made them understand that he wasn't going anywhere and neither were they, and one by one they came around to him. By the new year he'd gentled 4 head my mother had near given up on, good using horses now worth real money, and word got around Cedar Bench, the way word does, that the widow Hale had a man out at her place who could break a horse without breaking its spirit, and folks started bringing him their rough stock to gentle for a fee. That money kept us off the bank's books a while longer. Voss did not care for it. He came around in February, all smiles gone thin, and found Jonah in the corral working a colt, and the two of them looked at each other a long, quiet minute the way 2 dogs do, and Voss didn't get down off his horse, and he didn't say much, and he rode off, and he didn't come around again for a good while after. But it was more than the work. I want you to understand it was more than the work. He never raised his voice to me. He never raised his hand. He'd lost everything a man can lose, his name, his past, every face he'd ever known, and you'd think a man so robbed would have nothing left to give, but it was the opposite. It was like the bullet had taken away whatever hard thing he used to be and left only what was underneath, and what was underneath was patient and steady and kind. He'd let me follow him all day. He'd answer the same fool question 4 times without wearying. When I had a nightmare, I had them that winter of finding him dead at the creek, only in the dream it was my father. He'd come and sit on the edge of my bed in the dark, this big silent man, and not say much, just be there, solid, until I went back down. I started calling him Pa in the spring. I didn't decide to. It just came out one day at the corral, Pa, can I sit the fence? And the whole world went still. Jonah's hand stopped on the rope. My mother, who was at the line hanging wash, stopped with a wet shirt half pinned. I went red to my ears and looked at the ground because I knew, child as I was, that I'd reach for something I maybe wasn't allowed to have. Jonah crouched down in front of me. His face was working at something. Toby, he said, real careful. I'd be proud for you to call me that if your mother's all right with it. But you understand I might have a name somewhere. I might have, his voice caught, people. I might have folks of my own out there that I can't remember. It wouldn't be fair to let you call me something I might not get to keep being. I looked up at him. Did anybody come? I said. Did anybody ever come looking for you? It was a cruel thing for a child to say, though I didn't mean it cruel. I just meant it plain. In all those months, no one had come. No notice in the Marrow paper. No writer asking after a missing man. Whoever Jonah had been, the world had let him go down into that creek without raising a hand to keep him. Something closed in his face and then opened again, softer. No, he said quietly. No, Toby, nobody came. Then you can be mine, I said, with the awful certainty of 8 years old. Finders keepers. He made a sound that was half a laugh and half not, and he pulled me in against him, and over my head I heard my mother set down the wet shirt, and when I looked she had her hand pressed over her mouth, and she went into the house. And that was the only time in my whole life I saw my mother run from a thing instead of toward it. She came back out after a while with her face washed and ordinary, and she didn't say a word about it, but that night Jonah moved his bedroll out of the barn, where he'd taken to sleeping once he was well, and into the lean-to room off the kitchen, and nobody discussed it, and that was that. He was ours, near enough. We just hadn't said the rest of it out loud. It took them a long while to say it. They were both careful people, my mother and Jonah, careful in the way of folks who have been hurt and don't intend to be hurt again, and they circled each other through that whole spring and into summer like 2 people who each suspect the other of carrying something fragile. I saw it before they did. Children see it. I saw the way my mother started doing her hair of a morning when she'd let it go plain for years. I saw the way Jonah's eyes went to her across the yard and then away quick when she turned. I saw them at the fence of an evening after I was supposed to be asleep, The two of them just standing there in the last light, not touching, talking low about nothing. The weather, the colt, the price of hay at Marrow. And I understood, the way you understand a thing without words for it, that the nothing they were talking about was everything, and that they both knew it, and that neither one was brave enough yet to say so. It was the fear in him that held it back, I think, not the fear of her, the fear of himself. I heard them one night in June. I'd come for water and stopped in the dark of the hall when I heard their voices low in the kitchen, and I was a sneak of a boy and I stayed and listened, and I've never been sorry I did, because it told me the shape of the man. You can't know who I was, he was saying. His voice was rough. Cora, you've seen the marks on me. You heard what the doctor said. Whatever I had done, somebody put a bullet in my head for it and walked away easy. Men don't do that to a good man. They did it to somebody. They did it to the man I was. That man's not in this kitchen, my mother said. He might be, a chair scraped. He might come back. The memory might run back into me some morning and I might wake up and not be this. I might be him again. And I'd have let that boy. He stopped. I won't do that to you. I won't let you make a place in your life for a man who might be the worst kind of thing. You deserve to know what you're taking in. There was a quiet. Then my mother spoke, and I have never forgotten how she said it. Jonah, I took you in not knowing one thing about you but that you were dying and I had a bed. I've had near a year to learn the rest, and I'll tell you what I've learned. I've watched you with my son every day of that year. I've watched you with frightened animals and with frightened children and with a frightened woman, which is what I was when I found you, whether I'd have said so or not. A man can lose his memory. He can't lose his nature. Whoever you were before, whatever they punished you for, the man you are is the one who sat up nights with a boy's bad dreams and never once asked anything for it. I don't need to know your old name. I've watched you make a new one true. That's all the knowing I require. I heard nothing then for a long time. Then I heard, very quiet, my mother begin to cry, not the bad kind through the wall, the other kind, and I heard the chair again. And I crept back to my bed without my water and lay there grinning like a fool in the dark. Because I was 8 and I just knew, that I'd finally gotten the family back that the green horse and the bad fence had taken from me. They were married in August, by the circuit preacher, in our own yard under the cottonwood, with the widow Aldous and old Berto from the livery and Dr. Pyle come out from Marrow for witnesses. My mother wore a dress the color of the creek. Jonah wore a new shirt and couldn't keep his hands still. When the preacher asked his name for the register, Jonah looked at my mother and my mother looked back steady, and Jonah said, "Jonah Hale," and took her name for his own since he had none of his own to give, and nobody there but us 3 knew why and nobody asked. I stood up between them. The preacher made a small joke about it, the boy standing up at his own mother's wedding, and folks laughed kindly. But Jonah didn't laugh. He put his hand on my shoulder, heavy and sure, and he kept it there the whole time, and I have spent my whole life since trying to be worth the weight of that hand. For a season we were happy. I want to set that down clear because of what came after, so that you know it was real and that we had it. For a whole golden season we were a family on a hard place that was slowly, against all the town's predictions, beginning to thrive, the horses, the square barn, the note at the bank shrinking instead of growing, and my mother laughed at supper. And my new pa taught me to ride and rope and shoot a rabbit clean for the pot. And at night the 3 of us sat by the fire, and the dark outside held nothing worse than coyotes. We did not know, that golden season, that on a road far to the south, men were already asking questions. We did not know that a thing my pa had done in the life he couldn't remember had a long memory of its own, and that it was coming, slow and sure, up the country toward Antelope Creek to collect. It started with a handbill. My pa was in Cedar Bench in September, selling 2 gentled geldings to a freighter, and he came home that evening different, quiet in a way that wasn't his usual quiet. He sat down to supper and didn't eat, and after, when he thought I was asleep, I heard him and my mother in the kitchen again, and this time there wasn't any softness in it. There was something cold. There was a man in the bench today, Jonah said, asking the freighter about me, about the horsebreaker out at the Hale place, what he looked like, how long he'd been here. Maybe a man wanting stock gentled, my mother said. He had a paper. Jonah's voice was flat. I saw it folded in his coat when he turned. A handbill. Cora, I've been telling myself a year that the past stayed in that creek, but a man doesn't get shot in the head for nothing. And men don't ride hundreds of miles asking after a horsebreaker for nothing either. A long quiet. Then my mother, did you know him? The man asking. And here is the thing that frightened me, listening in the dark. My pa didn't say no. I don't know, he said slowly. When I saw him, when I saw his face, something turned over in me. Like a stone you lift and there's something under it you didn't want to see. I didn't get a name, I didn't get a memory, I just got, he stopped. I got that I knew him, and that I was afraid of him, and that, Cora, under the fear, there was a part of me that wasn't afraid at all. A part of me that went cold and steady and started counting where my hands were. Counting the distance, like it had done it 100 times before. Jonah. That's the man they shot, he said. That's the man I'm scared is still in here, and he just stood up. I lay in the dark with my heart going hard, and I understood, child as I was, that the golden season was over, and that something was coming up the country toward us, and that the worst part wasn't the something coming. It was that a part of the man I loved had been waiting all this while to meet it. It came 11 days later, in the last week of September, in the cold blue hour before dawn. I know now what we didn't know then, pieced it together over the years from the marshal, and from the few cracked memories that did finally come back to my pa, late in his older years. The man who'd been asking questions rode for an outfit out of the Southern Territory, road agents and worse, run by a man named Oral Das. And the man my pa had been, the man with the killer's scars, had ridden for Das too. Had been Das's best gun by all accounts until the day he wasn't. There'd been money, and there'd been a witness Das meant to silence and my pa wouldn't. And there'd been a falling out the way there always is among men like that. And Das had settled it the way men like that settle things. A bullet behind the ear and a body rolled into a creek, and a string of miles between him and the consequences. Only the bullet had skipped, and the creek hadn't drowned him, and a barefoot boy hunting crawdads had found what Das had thrown away. And now Das knew his dead man was walking, gentling horses for a widow up north, and a dead man who walks is a danger to a man who likes his enemies to stay dead. He came with 4 men. I woke to the dogs. We had 2 by then, and they went off all at once hard, and then one yelped and went silent. And I sat up in the cold dark, and my whole body knew before my mind did. I heard my pa's voice in the next room, low and fast, Cora, get the boy, the root cellar. Now and then the front of the house lit up orange, and I understood they'd fired the barn. What I remember next comes in pieces, the way bad things do. My mother's hands hauling me up, the shotgun off its pegs into her arms. The cold of the yard, the heat of the barn going up behind us, the horses screaming, my pa shoving the cellar door open and pushing us down into the dark of it, and crouching over the opening with my father's old pistol, Jonah's pistol now, held in a way I'd never seen him hold a thing, easy and terrible, like it had grown there. Stay down, he said to my mother. His voice was the cold one, the counting one. Whatever you hear, keep the boy down. Jonah, my mother grabbed his sleeve. There's 4 of them. I know how many there are. He looked at her, and for just a second the cold went out of his eyes, and the man I knew looked through. Cora, whatever I am out there in the next little while, whatever you see, that man dies tonight too. You understand me? I'm not coming back in here as him. I'm coming back as Jonah, or I'm not coming back. But I'm not letting them pass me to you. Not while I'm breathing. And he kissed her hard once, and he set the cellar door down over us, and he was gone. I am an old man now, and I have heard the rest of that night told 3 ways by my mother, who heard it from under the cellar door, by Marshal Beckett of Merrow County, who pieced it from the ground after, and by my pa, the little he'd ever say of it. I'll give it to you as true as I can make it, and no truer, because some of what happened out there in the dark belongs to a man who didn't want it remembered, and I'll honor that. There were 4 men and a fired barn meant to flush us into the open. Das had counted on a horse breaker and a widow. He had not counted on the man he'd left for dead, remembering, in his hands if not his head, every hard thing he'd ever learned about staying alive when men came to kill you. It did not go the way Das meant it to. The firelight that was supposed to expose us exposed them. 4 mounted men lit up orange against the dark while my pa moved in the black beyond it where they couldn't see, and he was patient, and he was quiet, and he did not waste a shot. My mother under the cellar door said it was the silences that frightened her worst. Long silences and then a single shot, close or far, and a man's voice cut off. Then silence again. She said it was like listening to something take a house apart one nail at a time. A barn burned. 2 of Das's men went down in the yard, and I will not tell you they died easy or that my pa took no joy in it, because I don't know, and the not knowing is part of what he carried. A 3rd broke and ran for his horse and got it and got gone, and was picked up 2 days later by Beckett 40 miles south and told the whole of it to save his neck. That left Das. My mother heard the last of it. She heard my pa's voice, out in the dark past the burning barn, and it was not the cold counting voice anymore. It was raw. You shot me in the head and rolled me in a creek, my pa said. He was somewhere near the corral. Das was somewhere near the house. I don't even remember it. You took my whole life and I can't remember one day of it. You know what I got instead, Oral? You know what I got to put where my life used to be? You got soft is what you got, Das's voice. Easy. A man who'd never once in his life believed he'd be the one to die. You always were going soft, Cole. It's why. That's not my name. A click in the dark. I got a wife. I got a boy who calls me Pa. I got a name a good woman gave me out of a story. And you rode all this way to take that too. A silence, terrible and short. I'm not going to let you. There was one shot, just the one. And then nothing. The fire crackling on the ruined barn. The horses settling. The dogs, the one that lived, whimpering somewhere. My mother under the door with her hand over my mouth and the shotgun in her other arm and her whole body shaking, waiting in the awful quiet to learn which man was going to lift that door. It was my pa. He pulled it up and the firelight fell on him, and he was bleeding from a long graze along the arm, and he was filthy with smoke, and he had the look of a man who has gone down into a deep cold place and dragged himself back up out of it by his own fingers, and he reached down into the dark of the cellar where his family was, and his hand was shaking now, just a man's hand again. It's over, he said, his voice broke on it. It's over, Cora, Toby, it's me, it's just me. My mother went up into his arms, and I went up into the both of theirs, and the 3 of us stood in the yard in the cold blue first light with the barn a heap of orange coals behind us, holding on to each other like people in a flood, holding on to the one thing that floats. Marshal Beckett came 2 days later with the runaway in irons and a wagon for the dead, and he and my pa walked out to the corral and talked a long while alone. I watched from the porch. I was scared. I'll own it, scared that the law had come to take my pa for the man he used to be. Beckett had the look of a man who'd seen handbills. He knew, or guessed, the shape of who Jonah Hale had been before a creek, and a widow remade him. But when they came back from the corral, Beckett took off his hat to my mother, which a man only does for someone he respects. Ma'am, he said, these men that came Das and his outfit, they're wanted in 3 territories, robbery, murder, worse. The territory'll likely pay a bounty on what your husband did here and earn it honest. He turned the hat in his hands. Now, there's been talk down south of a 5th man, a gun that rode with Das years back and crossed him and was killed for it. I came up here halfway expecting to find that man. He looked at my pa level. I don't find him. I find a horse breaker named Jonah Hale who defended his family from murderers in his own yard, and a dead man named Cole that I expect drowned in a creek some years back like the story always said. That's what's in my report. You understand me? My pa was very still. Why, he said. Beckett put his hat back on. Because I've been at this work 30 years, he said, and I have learned to tell the difference between a man who is bad and a man who has done bad things and climbed out of it. The first kind I run down. The second kind he swung up onto his horse. The second kind I leave be, on the rare day I'm lucky enough to find one. You climbed out, Hale. I can see it from here. Don't make me regret the report. And he touched his hat to my mother again and rode south with his prisoner and his wagon. And that was the last the law ever had to say about it. We built the barn back that fall, the three of us and half of Cedar Bench, because a strange thing had happened. The town that had spent 3 years waiting for the widow Hale to fail had watched a man stand in his own yard against 4 killers to keep his family alive, and a town, which is just people, had decided something different about us. Garrick Voss never came around again. The note at the bank got paid off entire the next spring. With bounty money my pa swore he'd never spend on himself and never did. It went into the land and the stock and, later, into schooling for me. By the time I was grown, the Hale place on Antelope Creek was the best horse outfit in the Coldwater country, and men came from 3 counties to buy what Jonah Hale gentled. And nobody but us ever knew that the steady, soft-spoken man they dealt with had once been somebody else entirely, somebody hard and lost, that a creek had given back. The memory never fully returned to him. Pieces did over the years, mostly bad ones, and he'd go quiet for a day or 2 when they came, and my mother always knew, and she'd send me off on some errand and sit with him the way she'd sat with him that first night, and after a while he'd come back to himself. To the self he'd chosen. Once, when I was near grown, I asked him straight out if he was sorry he never got his real name back, his real life. He thought about it a long while. We were on the corral fence in the evening, the way we'd been 1,000 times, watching the colts. There was a man, he said finally, who had a whole life, Toby, a name and folks and years, and every one of them led him to a place where he got shot in the head and thrown in a creek, and not one living soul came to look for him. That was his life, the whole sum of it. He nodded out at the colts, at the barn, at the lamp coming up gold in the kitchen window where my mother was. And there was a man who woke up in a creek with nothing, no name, no past. Nothing, and a boy looked at him and said, "You can be mine, finders keepers." And a woman gave him a name out of a story and a place to put it. He looked at me. I've thought about it more than you know, and I would not trade the second man's nothing for the first man's everything, not for the world entire. He died old in his sleep, in the bed my mother had given him that first night and shared with him near 40 years after. I held his hand at the end the way he'd held mine through every bad dream of my childhood, and his last words to me were my name, just my name, Toby, plain and sure, the way he'd said it at the corral when I was 8 and learning to throw a rope. And then he was gone, the man the creek gave back, gone back at last to whatever deep had spat him out. We never put his old name on the stone. There wasn't any old name to put. The stone says Jonah Hale, and under it, beloved husband and father, and under that, the only true thing about him that ever needed saying, he was ours. My mother found a dead man down by Antelope Creek the autumn I turned 8. I have had 60 years to find a gentler way to say it, and I never have, and I've stopped trying. He wasn't dead, and he was the best thing that ever happened to us, and I was the one who found him. I'll take the credit, the way a boy takes credit for the sunrise because he was awake to see it.